Hello everyone, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games' Lit Musings. I know it's been a little while, I'm sorry about that, but the Hotful Boyfriend analysis is coming up soon, and in the meantime I did want to do a bit of a more casual video on something that came up a whole lot in the comments on my most recent video about whether we should define games that aren't technically games as video games. That episode got a whole lot of discussion among some of the best and some of the worst comments I've ever gotten since starting this series, and chief among the topics discussed was the question of whether we should find a new name to call games that weren't necessarily traditional games. I did actually want to take that topic on in that video briefly, but it actually was a pretty big tangent, and the main point of that video was to condemn the use of the not a game argument to try and separate and devalue experiences that we don't appreciate, so it ended up not being there. That said, it did get a whole lot of discussion in the comments, so I figured I would just do a follow-up episode in a more casual format. This is a Musings episode, which just means that I'm kind of candidly sharing my thoughts. The stuff that I'm going to be saying in here isn't necessarily my polished final opinion so much as just kind of what I'm thinking about this, so take it as you will. So then, to summarize, the idea presented is that art games like Passage, visual novels like Hotful Boyfriend or Clannad or whatever, aren't technically games in the traditional definition of the word, and so we should come up with some other term besides video games to refer to them, for the sake of specificity. And while I definitely understand the sentiment behind this idea, I'm honestly not entirely sure it's something that should happen, and so I'm gonna try and do my best to explain why. The first, and probably the least problematic of these reasons, is simply that it's more difficult to come up with an accurate name for that than you might expect it to be. A whole lot of things have been suggested over time, and you'll see a lot of them if you go look at the comments of that last video, but, you know, they ranged from everything from interactive experience to video art to, I mean, you know, all sorts of things, but none of them quite work. I mean, this whole idea is for the sake of fixing an inaccurate name after all, so we would want the name that we make up here to be specific and accurate. That's kind of the entire point. But in order to do that, it would have to include two particular things. This art form is digital and video. The question of whether, you know, video as opposed to text on screen or pictures or something are necessary is up for debate. So at the very least, it's digital and it's interactive. Both of those things would have to be in a name if we want a more accurate and specific title for these kinds of interactive artworks. And when it comes down to it, I haven't seen a suggestion or been able to come up with one myself that includes both of those elements and accurately describes the medium without being completely unwieldy as a name for an art form. None of it would actually catch on or really be a workable term for it. And aside from that, if we did actually use a term like that, we would be kind of doing the opposite of what is being suggested here. We wouldn't be creating a name for a subgenre of video games that aren't games. We would be creating a name for all interactive art, and video games would end up being a subgenre of that. Like, technically speaking, anything that is just interactive digital art would be something that encompasses video games and all sorts of other things like the art games we're talking about here. So that wouldn't really work the way it's intended. But secondly, and more importantly, I just really don't think it's necessary. I mentioned in that video that video games are hardly the first medium to have a name that isn't a perfect one-to-one representation of what it actually is. Film isn't on celluloid anymore. Literature refers to a way more specific use of the written word than just the written word itself, and sculptures can be made with all sorts of different methods of sculpting that you couldn't necessarily technically call sculpting. All these things refer to a medium or a form of art, but don't necessarily perfectly accurately reflect the nature of that art form. But you don't find anyone taking issue with that, because we know what these things are, because they've developed over time to include a great variety of things and to change in some of their basic natures. You won't find anyone complaining that movies are called film even though they're not technically recorded on film anymore, because that name has just stuck around through changes to the medium and we still understand what it means, and that's not a problem. Now, some mentioned that it's false advertising, that if you're calling something like Dear Esther a game, then people want a game out of it and might accidentally buy it and expect a game and not get one, but come on guys. Firstly, that's not really how buying things works, or at least not how most people do it. You don't go to a movie and just be like, yes, I want one ticket for anything that's playing right now, as long as it can technically be called a motion picture. No, you go looking for something that you're interested in. Even if all you saw is a trailer, or even if a friend just said, hey, this movie's cool, you should go see it, you know something about it. You're not making a blind purchase. And especially with the internet age and with digital games. You know, you're not going to go to Steam, see Dear Esther, and just click that buy button before even looking at screenshots or reading the description. It is not difficult to be informed about what you buy, and most people generally only buy things that they want. It's not like someone's just gonna go looking for anything that is technically a video game and end up with Dear Esther. That's not really how things work. And the last reason in my mind might be a little petty, but I do think that there is more to this. Changing the medium in response to this controversy kind of feels like giving in a negative way. As mentioned in my previous video, and not to mention seen in basically any forum where this topic is being discussed, the whole not a game argument is used far more often to try and devalue things that didn't entertain people the way they expected than to actually try and further understand and define the elements of this art form. And that mindset, that exclusionary attitude towards things that don't quite fit your premeditated expectations for what a video game should be, is seriously bad for this medium and for its place in our society and for the community surrounding it. It's not a good thing. But that's where most of the pressure to change this comes from. Not from an idea of having a better way to refer to it, but by trying to separate it from video games. And as a result, it seems like, to me, changing what we call these things in response to a bunch of people who want to separate them from the medium that they understand and enjoy feels like affirming that mindset. And I really don't think that's a good idea. I mean, if we want to expand our terminology so we can refer to the interactive arts in more precise ways, I'm perfectly fine with that. But I want that to happen as a result of the natural expansion of language surrounding a blooming art form, so that we can have a more academic approach to talking about video games. That is a perfectly natural and very good thing that needs to happen, but this isn't happening for that reason. I'd much rather it comes about naturally as we're trying to more precisely and academically speak about video games, not just because some people were whining about Dear Esther not letting them headshot any guys. So that's my relatively candid 2 cents on the matter. Maybe if I get my thoughts a little more organized on this, you might see an episode about it in the future, a proper episode at least, but probably not before you'll see an episode about how we really need to stop using the term walking simulator. We'll see. In any case, be on the lookout sometime in the next week for my Hotful Boyfriend analysis, and I will be continuing on my normal schedule after that. So I look forward to seeing you then.